Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Brunt of It. I'm your host, Joel Van Brunt. If you are going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust like me? And if you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not do it, or why not allow me to point you in the right direction to build your awareness? I am interested in having grown-up conversations in today's world, as opposed to fifth grade recess shouting matches, which seems to be what the standard tone is in today's political discourse. Who would have thought that in today's world, the axis of kindness and civility would become a niche? But that seems to be the case. I've had 21 years of experience in the military, government, and small business, private sectors in a number of different industries: aviation, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, government, and the military. And I've led, coached, and mentored up to teams of up to 280, 290 people. I've lived in 16 different places across 8 states, and I've worked out of 12 states. So I've experienced a lot of the nation's cultures, whether it's New England culture, Southern culture, Midwest culture, West Coast culture, or here, most recently in Hawaii. And I aim to help guide you through the fog of war in life with all these competing pieces of information, contradictory pieces of information. This fog of war, we all make commitments philosophically, politically, culturally, and oftentimes we do so in a fog of war, meaning that that there's conflicting and contradictory information out there, and we have to still act. So I aim to help guide you through that with a couple key things to keep in mind as we go through information. And the first thing is the principle of awareness. The second thing is the principle of discernment. And the third thing is the principle of the sticky narrative, which we all have. So what are these briefly? And you've heard this before if you've watched this, but the principles of awareness. Are you aware of all of the context of an issue? And by context, I mean the other side, the strongest arguments from the other side, are you aware that there is another side? Is the news that you're getting or the information you're gathering into your brain, is it even acknowledging that there is another side, or is it just straw manning the other side so it can be dismissed pretty easily or ignored? So that's awareness. Discernment is interrogating the information that comes into your mind to see what the purpose is. If it's simply to persuade you with new arguments or new information, that's great. If it's alternatively, if it's just to connect with a prior belief through high emotion, then it may serve to blind you or further build up walls to disconfirming or challenging information about that narrative. And then finally, sticky narratives. So sticky narratives, we all have data points in life, whether it's with ideas or people, and we draw a line through these data points to make a narrative out of it. And they tend to be sticky because that's how we make sense of the world. And what I mean by sticky is, we try to take incoming information and fit it into that narrative that we've already created. And sometimes maybe a better idea would be to adjust our narrative. And if it's information that comes in that really challenges our narrative, we'll dismiss it or ignore it or reject it, and go stronger to our narrative because that's where our comfort zone is. So we all experience this, and I'm hoping to point these out as we discuss some things. But let's dive into it. So I always start off big to small COVID improvement project updates, 1% improvements. So I got some feedback from yesterday's show where the blinds behind me, they were kind of broken. And so I spent a couple minutes trying to really manhandle the blinds to try to fix them. So they're kind of fixed, but if I drop this shoulder, you'll see that down, I'm trying to block some of the problems with my body. So it looks a little bit better, which is great. So that's my 1% improvement today. And of course, I'm still diving into some other branding options of getting my content out there. And I'm bursting with ideas of what kind of content to deliver to you guys. So hopefully you can give me some feedback on that. I thought I'd first start off with a business and leadership lesson of the day. And this comes from my last 7 years of experience in small business. And it's a concept called expectation management. So yesterday I covered signals. Today I want to cover expectation management. What does that mean? We grossly underestimate, especially if we're interfacing with a customer and trying to deliver an experience or make them feel a certain way about a product. We grossly underestimate the expectation management that we have in businesses with customer-facing people. And in the case that I learned this, it was in the context of providing these aerial services to charter clients and to tourists who wanted to go look at a volcano from the air, for example, or fly from one island to the other. And the pilots would have a huge broad base of experience with which to compare what today's environment or what today's conditions look like compared to yesterday or last week. And so they've had the gamut of flights that had a little bit poorer weather, couldn't see as much, maybe some rain showers. And they also had the experiences where it was a clear blue day with hardly any clouds in the sky, just gorgeous. You could see everything. So they have this broad range of experience. And if they're not careful, they can feel a certain way. The pilot can feel a certain way about the upcoming experience based on what they know about the conditions. And that feeling can get transferred to the guests. And then the expectation of the guests is going to be affected by that. So I always use this example. It may be that there's a rain shower between you and the volcano, and you're going to have to go through it. And so for a bit, you're going to see some rain on the windscreen, and you may not get up to certain areas of the volcano that you may have gotten to yesterday. So the pilot can come in and brief the guests and say, well, we have this rain shower. Yesterday was a little bit better, but today we got some rain showers, so we'll have to go around there. And it looks like we're not going to be able to make it up to this section of the volcano, which is too bad. But we should be able to make it down here. Versus they come in and, hey guys, we got a great flight for you today. We're going to check out the volcano, and it's typical that we'll fly through some rain showers. So anticipating we'll see one or two of those today, but we're going to get up to the Eastern Rift Zone and we're going to check out these areas. And the energy is infectious. And if the pilot is excited about it, the guests are going to be excited about it. And this works. I've been in flights where, I thought that the guests were going to be very unhappy because the visibility was a little bit less than an ideal clear blue sky day. So there was some, rain showers off the left inland and some rain showers off the right out to sea. And the people get quiet. They're not that talkative. And then when we land, I'm thinking, they're going to complain about the experience. And we get out and they just high five me. That was amazing. That was so amazing. And so it was a good lesson for me to realize that my own expectations can be very divergent from the guests or the customer's expectations. That was an eye-opening thing for me. But the same is true for the people you work with. Your expectations can be way off of what your people's expectations are. So you can develop the skill of expectation management with the people you work with, whether that's in a team environment or whether you have direct reports working for you or whether you're managing expectations of your bosses. So that's kind of the business and leadership lesson of the day, expectation management. Really think about that and be deliberate in your expectation management. I got into a rabbit hole of the Heterodox Academy, which is Jonathan Haidt's online academy. And I think I heard this on another podcast. So that's what kind of led me down this rabbit hole. And there's 3 articles I wanted to discuss because I feel like these articles back up some themes that I've been talking about, namely that we have sticky narratives, and in the political realm, conservatives and liberals and leftists, we have sticky narratives. It's very difficult for us to break out of the narrative. And it also there's also another article that speaks to the theme of weaponizing information and kind of removing context or intimidation, cancel culture, where you're shaming people and trying to shut them down for their ideas and delegitimize their point of view. And then a third article talks about models. I've been very skeptical of models. I've talked a lot about models in the case of the coronavirus pandemic. And so there was another article that talks about how we should approach models. And I feel like connecting the models to the sticky narratives, in today's discussions about opening up the economy, we have sticky narratives that go back to the models, the early models and the death rates and whatnot. And so I think that we we take those models, and I've talked about this in the past, where we take model of our choice or expert of our choice, and we use that as a cudgel to beat the other side politically and assume ill intent and basically caricaturize their position. So I thought I'd talk about that, and then I'll kind of go into some distinctions on teaching history, Western civilization, and of course the Pulitzer that came out yesterday for the 1619 Project. And then we'll get into some COVID stuff, and then I got to clean up some discussion from yesterday on Michael Flynn. So it's going to be a good show, and let's dive into the Heterodox Academy. So the first article I want to talk about is an article titled "Why Conservatives and Liberals Are Not Experiencing the Same Pandemic." And so it takes a look at possible reasons that conservatives seem to downplay or have apathy toward COVID-19, and why liberals seem to have a healthy alertness or fear of COVID-19. And you would think that historically it would be maybe the reverse, like the conservatives would be more fearful of something like a pandemic. So this article proposes two reasons for the positioning and the outcomes for conservatives and liberals as it relates to COVID-19. And they propose personal experience. So if you have any personal experience with COVID-19, family members or friends, and they posit the political lens that you have, in other words, your prior beliefs, or what I like to say, your sticky narrative. And so it does it by a survey. So it questions a bunch of people, and I can't remember how many people it was. It was like 1,800 people maybe. And survey social science is tricky because sometimes you can't repeat it, but it does reveal some things about people's self-reported attitudes and behaviors. So it's interesting how they did. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the study. The results were striking. We found little evidence that different experiences with COVID-19 account for liberals and conservatives' different views of the pandemic. Instead, participants desired political outcomes more consistently accounted for ideological differences in disease threat perception. The figure below reports the indirect effects of both political beliefs and experiences across the three studies. These indirect effects are measurements of the degree to which the relationship between political ideology and perceived COVID-19 threat is accounted for by A desired political outcomes related to COVID-19, or B, participants' exposure to or experiences with the effects of the disease. So 3 different studies, and they all show the exact same thing, which is the political beliefs far outweigh the experiences for shaping people's beliefs about COVID-19. What kinds of ideological goals were most important in explaining conservatives' relative apathy toward COVID-19? Out of 6, the strongest effects emerged for goals that involved government-imposed social distancing rules. Conservatives oppose the government telling them when they can and cannot leave their homes. Liberals support such policies. Because a threatening disease might validate government interventions that conservatives dislike, conservatives appear motivated to downplay the severity. Or conversely, because a threatening disease might validate government interventions that liberals do like, liberals seem motivated to magnify the threat. Note that our results cannot say which of these is happening in greater measure. Well, as Ben Shapiro earlier today pointed out, it's probably both. So this was really interesting that your political prior belief, your sticky narrative about COVID-19 and government intervention tends to influence or be correlated. Now, correlation doesn't equal causation in statistics, but it tends to be highly correlated with how you view the pandemic. So that was an interesting article to come across, and it was discussed by Ben Shapiro as well in his podcast today, which is where I first heard of it. But this led me into some other articles which were not discussed that I thought I'd also go over. The second one is titled Understanding the Campus Expression Climate. And this one's really interesting. So this looked at, 1,580 students and tried to test how reluctant versus comfortable they felt in the classroom giving their opinions on politics, race, religion, sexuality, and gender, and non-controversial topics. So that's what they did, and I'm just going to read a little bit from the executive summary to see what some of the findings were. The survey indicated that 58.5% of students were somewhat or very reluctant to give their views on at least one of the 5 controversial topics. Politics elicited the highest amount of reluctance, 32% of the sample being reluctant, with an average reluctance of 24 across topics. Students from different demographic categories were reluctant to speak about different kinds of topics. For example, white students were especially reluctant to give their views on matters related to race. Women were more reluctant to give their views on politics and religion, while men were more reluctant to give their views on gender. Republican students were more reluctant than students who identify with other political groups to give their views on politics, race, sexuality, and gender. We also report reluctance estimates by academic discipline, religion, and geographic location. Importantly, we also found that reluctant students most feared being criticized for their views by other students. So this is kind of like a self-silencing effect that's happening in academia. And I've spoken about this before in the show, that I actually kind of experienced this to a certain degree in grad school. And at the time, my thinking on political topics and policy was not that developed yet. I thought about a lot of things, but I was, grad school exposes you to a whole slew of new information. And so I was in the process of real-time evaluating information, but I still had core convictions, from my conservative Christian background. So as a result of that, I kind of laid low in class sometimes and didn't speak up, even though I would disagree with the speaker and identify information that they either weren't aware of or were downplaying. And so I always admired the conservatives in the classroom that would speak up and present a defense of that position. And we were in the minority where I went to school. We were probably, I would say, maybe 25% of the student population. So we were outnumbered by the left side of the aisle, almost two or 3-1 or so. So, so I've had personal experience with this, and I just thought it was interesting that this came out of this deep dive into the Heterodox Academy. But I think it doesn't just exist at the university level. Okay, so what I'm going to posit is that this exists in our bubble cultures around the country. Wherever you live, whether it's a liberal or conservative place, then you're going to be environments where you're going to self-select not to discuss your opinions out of fear of being criticized by your peers. And I've talked to family members who've felt this in New York State. If you've lived in a big city, you might have experienced this, depending on what group of people you hang out with. And the thinking seems to be very uniform and without a whole lot of challenging viewpoints expressed, especially people who self-censor their views. So that was the second article I wanted to talk about, and I thought that was fascinating. That's, it'd be interesting to see how we can change that, together, how we can instill a culture where people feel like they can speak up and not fear that criticism from peers or others. And sometimes people have to work out their thinking verbally. I'm a person who works out my thinking verbally oftentimes, and I know other people like that too. So it'd be interesting to see how we change this. And maybe one way is to establish ground rules in certain dialogues where, you're not going to attack the person. You're not going to ad hominem the person. You're going to listen to their argument, listen to their case, and you're going to respond to their case and the arguments and the words that they use as opposed to the person. That would be nice. That would be an adult conversation, a grown-up conversation. So anyway, thought I'd throw that out there for consumption. And then the third article in the Heterodox Academy was rules of thumb for evaluating statistical models. And the reason I selected this one is because it's in line with the theme of being skeptical about models. And as you know, with COVID-19, we've had many models that have come out of Great Britain, out of the University of Washington. And the University of Washington has been updated. Its projection just recently went up to about 100,000 from 68,000 or so. So it's getting updated with real-time data from across the country, and that's the nice part about the model. But as I mentioned earlier, the models can be sticky and confirm prior ideological beliefs, going back to why liberals and conservatives are not experiencing the same pandemic. So this one suggests ways in which we can think about models. And I found this useful in clarifying some thinking, and because it's really along the same lines that I've been talking about for the last several weeks. So how should we judge coronavirus models? And more broadly, the gusher of articles about coronavirus and its effects? How should we work to improve the models? I think these are some useful rules of thumb to keep in mind. So there's about 5 or 6 bullet points. Number 1, reserve judgment on claims that the rate of coronavirus deaths correlates with X. Too many observational studies in recent years have produced false correlations simply by looking for relationships between X and everything else in the world and discovering fluke correlations by sheer chance. If you read the words correlation or association near coronavirus, pause and take a look at the methodology behind that claim. Okay, that's the first one. Second, we must work to get the maximum amount of data fully accessible to the public as quickly as possible. We don't yet have the most basic information, such as how many people actually have been infected. We need massive numbers of coronavirus tests to get better data for our models. That's 2. 3, rather than choosing which model to believe, we must think in terms of updating an ensemble of coronavirus models as quickly and efficiently as possible. Much highly technical debate among statisticians regards how we should update our models. War to the knife between Bayesians and frequentists. I believe, following Karl Popper, that we should work continuingly to attempt to falsify models and to provide falsifiable models. This points toward the insights of error statistics philosophy, which focuses on a theoretical level on the need to craft useful falsifiable models as a way to frame our examination and updating of models. So this is great. I mean, this is like as part of the process, having falsifiable models so that you can know that you can kind of rule some things out. You can rule models out, which it seems to be not the case with coronavirus, with COVID-19. So that's interesting. Fourth, we should be aware that no model will provide us perfect knowledge. A great many scientific disciplines cannot provide us perfect knowledge. We must work instead to maximize the amount of knowledge we have. Policymakers must ultimately make their decisions knowing that no model provides scientific certainty. The public should judge policymakers knowing that they had to make their decisions with limited information, the fog of war. So this goes back to the fog of war. You have competing information, competing models that have different predictions, vastly variant ranges and assumptions put into them. And that's the fog of war. And we have to judge policymakers knowing that their decisions come with limited information. Boy, wouldn't that be nice if we were doing that today? But alas, only one side is showing that charity. And interestingly, this article, I forgot to mention, I think above, we should also approach scientific modelers with a spirit of charity. The spirit of charity is a big, I'm big on the spirit of charity, okay? Why? Because it forces you to consider charitable interpretations of events or of people. And imagine if, for example, there was way more charitable interpretation of the press of Donald Trump. That might elevate the dialogue and then decrease the bullying tactic that Trump seems to have with the press, which I covered yesterday. He revealed on Fox News why he was hard on the press. So charity. All right. Fifth, we should try to incorporate intelligent policy response to existing data into our models in order to model effective government policy. There's a strong case that epidemiological statistics as a discipline does not model such responses adequately, and thus has recommended unnecessarily large government responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Although we should be charitable to epidemiologists, we should also examine epidemiology for disciplinary blinders and not simply defer to epidemiologists' claim of expertise. I love this bullet point because this goes back to what I've been saying for since I started this podcast, which is you have other experts looking at the work of epidemiologists. And I had a professor in grad school who was an econometrics professor. He had a degree in economics, and he spent his whole career basically looking at medical articles and poking holes in their methodology with statistical methods. And so I'm fully in favor of cross-discipline expertise looking in, because you can get a level of groupthink in any one narrow specified field, and that's for sure. I like the cross-discipline thing. So I love this bullet point. Yes, epidemiologists have a level of expertise. Yes, they could be susceptible to blind spots in their methodology. And it helps to get data scientists and statisticians and mathematicians, the mathematician from Israel, for example, data scientists from Silicon Valley, and other folks who've looked at the statistical analysis and come up with very eerily similar conclusions and predictions as the antibody tests are producing, for example. So that's the fifth. Sixth, we must try not to fall prey to groupthink. Whether we think the lockdown needs to be extended indefinitely or ended immediately, we need to listen carefully to people arguing the opposite point of view. This is particularly difficult when the stakes are so immediate and so high. Yet it is precisely for this reason that we should listen to a wide variety of points of view and make sure the corresponding data are publicly accessible, so as to allow for informed debate among contrary opinions. The structure to avoid groupthink applies to the experts informing government policy, but our first duty is to rid ourselves of groupthink, not to point out gleefully the groupthink in our neighbor's eye. I love this too, because this goes to the sticky narrative. The groupthink really reinforces your prior beliefs. And if you find experts or neighbors or people on your side who are just reinforcing your own prior beliefs and prior thoughts on things, then it's not really that helpful, and it blinds you to other information that might push against and evolve your narrative and grow your context, grow your awareness about the issue. So these 6 bullet points are exactly in line with what I'm trying to accomplish with this podcast, in equipping people with methods to identify these things. Ask yourself questions like, am I getting the full context? Am I getting the other person's, the other side of this issue? Can I imagine the other side of the issue and strengthen it to the max extent practical, kind of like a debate team? And this will serve the public discourse well. This will elevate all of us who are involved in this conversation. So anyway, I'm going to move on, but I thought this was a great rabbit hole to discuss in the context of many of the themes that have come up in this show. Moving on, there's this friction about teaching history, and you can look at history through the sticky narrative lens as well. I realized this when I was in grad school, and I had an economics class, and it was a class on the presidency as the economist in chief. And it looked at American presidents from the Great Depression all the way up to the present day. This was before Trump, and analyzed their economic policy. And for that school, for that course, it was one of my favorite courses, taught by a gentleman named Professor Parker, who went on to get an award for teaching. He was fantastic. He studied at Dartmouth. He played football. He was a big guy. I think he was an offensive lineman or somebody, some position like that. And he was one of my favorite professors when I was at Harvard. So he had 2 books that we had to read for this course, 2 main books. There's a bunch of other reading, obviously. One of them was called More by Robert Collins, and one of them was called Presidential Economics by Herbert Stein. Now, these 2 books were histories of economics from about the Great Depression all the way through the 80s and 90s. I think the Herbert Stein one ended a little bit earlier. But if you read them side by side, you would see how divergent their view of the historical narrative was. So one really followed the Keynesian kind of economic model. Keynesian economics, a famous British guy named Keynes, he came up with sticky prices. That was his big contribution to economics. And it's somewhat right. And coming out of the Great Depression into World War II kind of validates Keynesian economics and stimulus spending. And then on the other side was more this classical approach leading up into supply side economics and that kind of stuff in the 80s. So they had very different explanations for historical events, for stagflation in the 70s, for coming off the gold standard, the Bretton Woods Agreement, and all these things that happened over the last 70 years, 80 years. Fascinating. And so I was so intrigued because I was an engineering major in undergrad. So I had never been exposed in the same course to 2 very different narratives about history. And I found it very eye-opening. And I remember asking Professor Parker about why he chose these books and how it could, we never really delved into which side had better arguments or whatnot. And he wasn't interested in solving that problem. He was more interested in exposing and explaining that historians tackle history through narrative, and the narrative changes over time. So a historian studying the Great Depression in the 70s, for example, is going to have a slightly different narrative than a historian studying the Great Depression in the 2000s or, last year. So there's kind of this evolution or progression of historical analysis as people, review former historians' work and then provide a new angle, a new narrative, slightly update the narrative on those events. So really fascinating. And moving back even further, there's a few books I read before grad school that were influential on me in terms of historical narratives. One of them was a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And I read this a long time ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago now. And it was all about the history that you didn't learn in high school, European history or American history. And you come out of that really like, really, maybe we weren't as good as we thought we were. Maybe it's all propaganda in high school. And I remember thinking that and thinking, why didn't we discuss this stuff? So that was one book. And then another book was Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And this was by, I believe, somebody who was in the CIA or somewhere. And he talks about basically imperialism through economic means post World War II, which he was heavily involved in various capacities. So it's Confessions of an Economic Hitman, fascinating book. And you don't know about that narrative, looking at history and imperialism through that lens. So those were influential on me, but there's a risk of pivoting all the way too far to the other side. When you hear some information that's contradictory to what you've seen, or maybe you feel like, you were doped by your high school history teacher, and then you go all the way to the other side and say everything is, you become a radical skeptic of everything Western civilization, of everything American history or European history or whatnot. And so that to me is kind of where we are now. And I'll follow up with one personal example that goes back to some of my military training. So yesterday, the New York Times got a Pulitzer for the 1619 Project, which is a project that analyzes American history from the perspective of slavery. And so they got a Pulitzer. And what's interesting is I knew when this came out, but I didn't really follow the debate too much. I did, hear loosely that there were historians that were critical of some factual claims that this project had. And, more right-wing outlets or right-leaning outlets like the National Review or the Wall Street Journal were very critical of this project. And to me, this was recasting American history in a narrative that was kind of nasty and connected with people's modern day feelings, at least on one side of the aisle, about racism and sexism and that kind of thing. So it's interesting they got a Pulitzer. Now, in contrast with that, National Review had a great piece, I think yesterday, about why we must continue to teach Western civilization. And I thought about that. A lot of my knowledge of Western civilization came from high school European history course and then just self-study. And I wouldn't know the value of Western civilization without those two courses, or those two elements of my personal education, my high school AP European history course and my self-study with, understanding the classics and European history and the Peloponnesian Wars and all kinds of events that led up to Carnage and Culture by Victor Davis Hanson, a great book. So all these events that led and culminated in Western values. So the National Review article makes a good case that we need to get back into teaching Western civilization as something we should value and cherish. And it looks at the courses in academia and how Western civilization courses are virtually non-existent because, there's a movement in academia to drown out the, old European white men who wrote a lot of these works and that were in these courses. So I feel like the pendulum is just swinging a little too far. And the 1619, they want to get this information out in the curricula for high school and whatnot. And so you risk a whole generation of people being exposed to this narrative without the other narrative, which is kind of the reverse of what I was exposed to. I was exposed to the Western civilization narrative loosely, and then exposed to some pushing against that with these books I mentioned and other things. So why is this important? Because we really, to be a successful country and a successful culture, we want to kind of root for our own winning, right? We want to root that we're going to succeed. And if the analysis by, let's say, half the population is that our current, culture and civilization is evil and corrupt and immoral and responsible for great harms and irredeemable, then there's further justification to just tear it all down and to just tear it all down and burn it to the ground. And you can see this in the radical left. You can see this in some of the Bernie supporters. You can see this in the political space, that there's this desire to tear it all down, which I disagree with. And I don't know about you. I think that's not where we need to go. America is, in my view, the U.S. is the most amazing success story in history. And as a part of the military, I tell a lot of people in the military that I view, the military team, the Marine Corps in particular, as the greatest team that history has ever produced, ever, anywhere, any country, anytime. The greatest team ever produced, the United States Marine Corps. That's my opinion, but I think you could probably make a pretty strong case that it is the best team history has produced. So we have a lot to be thankful for and proud of, and our values. And I wanted to bring out one quote, or one interesting thing, and I'll see if I can find it. Or do I get to this here in a second? Let's see. Where is it? Oh. Yeah, so there's a back and forth that I looked up with the historians, going back and forth with the New York Times, and the New York Times replying to them. So, I know where it is. Okay, in the National Review article. So this belief that Western civilization is at heart morally defective has recently been exemplified by the New York Times' inane and wildly historically inaccurate 1619 project, which essentially attempts to present the entirety of American history from Plymouth Rock to today solely through the prism of race and slavery. So that's a little background on the project. For all that we must, of course, take proper cognizance of other cultures. The legacy of Western culture in terms of both its sheer quality and its quantity is unsurpassed in human history. So we are deliberately underplaying many of the greatest contributions made to poetry, architecture, philosophy, music, and art by ignoring the fact, often simply in order to try to feel less guilty about imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, even though the last was a moral crime committed by only a minority of some few people's great-great-great-grandparents. So it's making the case that you're kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And then there's one other part of this article that I'm trying to see if it was in this article, and I'm pretty sure it was, but I might not be able to find it. But, and it was, in regards to the Declaration of Human Rights. Let me see. Okay. So this is just to kind of compare and contrast. I'm getting texted probably by my wife. Okay. No, not my wife. Okay. So this is out of the National Review, Why We Must Teach Western Civilization article. In response to the issuing of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which, as an aside, was very influential on my grandfather, who was an FDR Democrat until he died. The American Anthropological Association released a critique that asked, quote, how can the proposed declaration be applicable to all human beings and not to a statement of rights conceived only in terms of the values prevalent in the countries of Western Europe and America? End quote. The question assumes that the 30 articles of the Declaration could not be universal, since universality of human rights was of necessity a Western assumption. This was intended as a criticism and not as an endorsement. So in other words, it was, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was saying, wait a second, this whole concept of human rights is a Western invention, is a Western construct. So why would you hold Eastern countries or countries outside the Western Bloc to that standard? And that's the critique being made. And we often don't realize that in the West. We kind of assume that human values and human rights are universal because that's our anchoring point in Western philosophy. But that's not the case. That's not the case. If you go outside the West, then their assumptions about human rights is very different. It's very different and informed by different belief structures. And you may not be exposed to that if you've grown up and lived your entire life in the West and not traveled, not talked to people in other countries and other cultures about these kinds of issues. So I'm glad I found it. I wanted to make sure I talked about it and, just beware of the content coming down about historical revisionism and you can see it in the short term in politics all the time, revisionism about how, what people's response were back in Brett Kavanaugh, during the Christine Blasey Ford stuff and, revising history in light of what, Joe Biden is dealing with today with Tara Reade's allegation, or revising history going back into January and February with really how much we knew about COVID-19 at the time, how much of a threat we thought it was, and what action was either taken or not taken. There's a whole movement to revise just 2 or 3 months ago, in my view. So you really got to interrogate that information. 1619 Project information coming into your mind from the New York Times, interrogate it. Ask what it's designed for. Try to search out and seek a counterpoint to some of the claims. That'll help you. Now, we're all time limited, so we can't always do that. We can't always devote the time to that we want to. But just be aware of how much this influences you in the absence of larger context. That would be my recommendation. So interrogate, understand sticky narratives, and try to elevate your awareness as best you can. And then if you have to be agnostic or not take a decision based on whether the 1609 Project is more valid than classical history, looking at American history, then maybe don't take a position. Maybe reserve judgment, but wait for that other side of the context to be filled out in the next week or the next year, next 5 years. Just play the long game with some of this stuff. All right, so moving into COVID, I sat through a grassroots initiative in Hawaii discussion with Jacob Sullum, who is a columnist at Reason.com, a contributor. And he talked about the CDC and the FDA timeline in February and kind of what we know about COVID and the modeling and the testing. And it was a really interesting discussion. And it validated a lot of the reporting that I've done in this show over the last four weeks or so. So it was good to see a professional in the field, say a lot of the similar things about antibody tests, about testing, about the numerator and the denominator challenges with mortality rates, about the case fatality rate versus the infection fatality rate, and how we're confusing one with the other, and how the case fatality rate is entirely dependent on the number of tests. So it was a good discussion, but when we talked about coming out of it, he said, here we are, several months into this thing. We still don't know how prevalent it is. We still don't know how many carriers are asymptomatic. We don't know what share of the population will ultimately get infected. We don't know how fast the virus spreads. We don't know really how deadly the virus is. So there's so much unknown that it's difficult to know what to do. This is the fog of war with regard to coronavirus. So, the proposal is, everybody, I think, agrees that if we open, we should open smartly and wisely with maximizing protection and mitigation for the most vulnerable, which in this case seems to be, up to now seems to be the elderly and people with pre-existing conditions. So I think everybody agrees with that. Now, whether you lock down young, healthy people who otherwise could work is where you get the kind of the left and right battling back and forth. So I asked Jacob Sullum this question in this grassroots initiative. I said, how come there's been no real public discourse on who assumes the risk decision? Is it the state or is it the individual? And when does it transition from one to the other? And, of course, on the reopening side, there's a strong leaning that the individual can make the best risk decision. And on the maintaining the lockdown and the stay at home, into June and July, is the other side where the risk decision, because it's a public health thing, lies more with the state. So this is the friction right now that we're seeing in this pandemic. His answer was that it's basically both, but he agreed that there's not been a real good discussion publicly about it. So it'd be nice to see politicians standing up and saying, look, we're going to break the risk decision. The state is going to keep this risk decision and the individuals are going to keep this risk decision. And this is the policy to allow for that to happen. And this is why we're doing it, because we feel like the risk decision in these cases is best positioned at these levels. That's not happening. I haven't heard that anywhere. And politicians are in a tough spot because they want to look strong. They don't want to have people die on their watch. They don't want to open prematurely, but they also don't want to send their own local economies into unrecoverable spirals. So we'll see, what happens. But it was an interesting discussion. And what I'd like to suggest is that what would elevate the dialogue is to discuss risk decisions and who's best positioned to make those risk decisions. Is it the state? Is it the individual? And when? He also wrote an article called The 8 Possible Reasons for Huge International Differences in COVID-19 Deaths. This is from Reason. It was published today, I believe. And so he came up with reporting differences, stage of the epidemic, so different locations are in different stages, age demographics, there might be younger populations, older populations like Italy, social customs, this has been brought up in places like South Korea and Sweden, climate, so warmer, sunnier location versus colder, remaining indoors. Population density, huge issue with New York City, undoubtedly. Government policy, so this is the, when do you lock down, when do you stay at home? And luck. Luck is his last one. So we're all over the map. He was saying today that the antibody tests are suggesting anywhere from 0.1 to 0.6% infection fatality rate, which is a pretty wide range. But if you look at the case fatality rate, it's even crazier. The crude case fatality rate ranges from 0.6% in Iceland up to 15% in the UK. 15%. 0.6% in Iceland, all the way up to 15%. So we're all over the map. A lot of fog of war still at play in this whole discussion. What I did like seeing is I reported on Congress coming back to work on a Monday, not having tests. The doctor advised, hey, I don't have enough tests. And so the administration tweeted, hey, we're going to send you tests, this big machine, you can do with it what you will. And then there's a joint statement in Congress from Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell that said, hey, don't send those tests to us. Send those to the front lines. So I thought that was really cool. That was a really good gesture by Congress to the American people. I really like that they both jointly said thanks, but no thanks. Send that out to the front lines. So that was good. CNN announced the price of reopening was tens of thousands of lives. So this is framing the reopening in the cost of death narrative. And to which I respond, yes. We knew this. We knew this the entire time. Without a cure, without a vaccine, and without treatment, people are going to get infected, and people who get infected are going to die. And social distancing can slow it down, but it can't necessarily stop it. And it seems to be the case that many people think that we can stop it. But even if you do slow it down to a slow crawl, when you reopen, you see those second spikes, which everybody's talking about right now. So the herd immunity take, which Sweden is executing, suggests that you want to actually maybe in some cases accelerate the infection so that you can reach that herd immunity quicker, and the impact on your economy isn't going to be as severe. So tens of thousands of lives, according to CNN. The Washington Post reported on the mental health toll, which I thought was good. So suicides, depression, that kind of thing. Kind of in line with what I've been saying for a while, the cure being worse than the disease. And then Vox, I thought I'd mentioned Vox a little bit, that, and maybe National Review here. I got to open this article because I wasn't going to talk about it, but I may talk about this. Oh, okay. I think it was something slightly different I was thinking of. But so Vox had 2 articles, and Article 1 was basically that the data is in conflict. The data is at odds with Trump's push to reopen. And so this was suggesting that, we can now know the projection of how many deaths we're going to have. It seems like it's going up to 100,000. The estimates have been revised by Trump himself up to that. And so this is kind of in the same lines of, hey, you can see how the context can be shifted and the framing can be shifted to not paying attention to the data, ignoring the data and to reopen, sacrificing people for the economy, for the mighty dollar. These are unhelpful. These are entirely unhelpful, and they straw man and caricaturize the reopening crowd, of which I am one. So be careful of that. If that's you, if you're caricaturizing or straw manning the reopening crowd, no, we don't want more people to die. No, we don't want grandmother to die. But we realize that there's risk decisions that have to be made. And when the risk decision on a global scale is 130 million people starving by the end of the year because of the collapse in the world economy, well, maybe that's the cure being worse than the disease. Death from hunger is just as effective as death from COVID-19. The end result is you both die. So Vox had a second article that was trying to push for this federal job guarantee. So I cautioned a while back that, in the time of crisis, people will attach their ideological policy proposals to the crisis and justify it with the current failures that they perceive. And so this is one that was advocating for federal jobs guarantee with the Green New Deal as part of a stimulus out of this COVID-19 recession/depression, shutdown of the economy. So there it is, Vox advocating for that openly. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that our economy was strong. It was really good. We had very low unemployment prior to this moment. And as long as we reopen sooner rather than later, it seems like things will bounce back fairly quickly. It'll take maybe a year or two to recover, but it shouldn't prolong into a multi-decade or 10-year Great Depression. Knock on wood. So I thought I'd mention that in Vox. And then National Review took issue with, there's been criticism of the immigration policies and shutting down the borders. And Stephen Miller, one of the advisors of Trump, has been literally demonized because, as being racist and whatnot and justifying, so this would be the critique on the right, is that using this pandemic to attach their favorite policy proposal, in this case, stronger border protection, shutting down the borders, closing down immigration. So, that's the risk on the right. But as this article points out, he's, in this case, he's been pretty consistent in his position on closing down the borders. And it was pointing out that the New York Times was kind of taking things out of context to distort his position and make it a little bit different than it actually is. So using some angles, and the National Review kind of points that out. So again, like I said, if you want to have wide awareness of an issue, multiple sources from right-leaning, left-leaning, so you can get a really good perspective on things. And Real Clear Politics, again, an aggregator that I would highly recommend because it does match headlines that are opposing one on top of another. So it's a good tool to use. All right, I'm not going to get into that too much more than I just did, but I want to talk about now Let me see if I have anything else to talk about. Okay, there's a Real Clear Politics article that talks about the WHO failing to learn from the SARS epidemic back in 2003. And this one is actually pretty interesting. So let me just pull it up real quick. So out of 2003, which also originated in China, the WHO came up with some new regulations. Now, here's what the regulations read. There's a couple that are pertinent. Article 6 of the International Health Regulations legally obligate all WHO members to inform WHO of any positive SARS test within 24 hours. By December 27th, Chinese health officials knew that the outbreak in Wuhan was caused by a virus 87% similar to the one that caused the 2003 pandemic. By December 30th, a Wuhan lab reported that multiple patients had tested positive for an unknown SARS coronavirus. At the latest, the Chinese government should have reported it to the WHO on December 31st. Instead, CCP lies to WHO and reports it as pneumonia. The committee Republicans said in a one-page explanation of the findings. On December 27th and January 3rd, more Chinese labs began reporting positive SARS cases. But again, the CCP didn't report to the WHO at that time, the committee Republicans found. In fact, they didn't report any SARS cases until they finally alerted the WHO of the virus's genetic sequence, showing it similar to SARS on January 12th. January 12th, so almost 2 weeks later. And then the other articles that kind of got revised out of the 2003 episode with SARS, Article 6 and 7. Article 6 and 7 of the IHR rules also legally obligate all WHO members to provide the WHO with all relevant public health information, including lab results. On January 2nd, the Wuhan Institute of Virology completed a mapping of the genetic sequence of the coronavirus responsible for the outbreak. Instead of reporting that information, China sat on it for 10 days and sent it to the WHO only after a researcher in Shanghai published his own genetic mapping results online, the committee Republicans found. The Chinese government subsequently shut down the Shanghai Public Health Center where the researcher worked. In the midst of China's failures to report the virus to the WHO in late December, the WHO reportedly ignored Taiwanese officials' December 31st reporting on SARS cases in China. Such a failure to follow up on those reports from Taiwan constitutes a violation of Article 9 of the WHO rules, mandating the body investigate unofficial reports that warn of SARS cases. 5 days later, a member of the WHO Collaboration Center for Infectious Disease Epidemiology and Control at the University of Hong Kong, which works with the WHO to strengthen surveillance of viruses and plan emergency responses to new pathogens, publicly warned that the high likelihood of human-to-human transmission of COVID-19. Despite being designated by the WHO as an expert in emergency response to novel outbreaks, there is no evidence that the WHO investigated his warnings, the panel's Republicans asserted. In addition, the WHO continued to parrot a CCP lie that the disease wasn't transmitted human to human until the CCP confirmed it was occurring on January 29th, including this tweet on January 14th. And then it has a tweet. So this is pretty bad. Now, this is reported in Real Clear Politics. I haven't seen this reported anywhere else, but I would think that this story would grow in momentum. And good on the House for, I think this is from the House, good on Congress for investigating this. It'd be nice if the media also started to dig into this a little bit more. So that's some lessons learned on trusting the WHO. All right, politics. Lastly, almost at an hour. Yesterday, I've been defending Michael Flynn and all the documentation that's come out in the last couple of weeks that really look like they exonerate him from any wrongdoing. It looks like he was set up and entrapped by the FBI, although it wasn't an official investigation. It was kind of a casual conversation. And then they pinned a statement on him as a lie and then later threatened to prosecute his son unless he pled guilty. And really was violating the FARA, the Foreign Agent Reporting Act, I think is what the full title of that is. And so somebody challenged me on this, on a comment. Foreign Agents Registration Act is what it was. So he said, hey, do these articles, and mostly it's the National Review and the Hill and the Federalists that are reporting on this, and no other outlets are reporting on it. And he was saying, hey, are these outlets reporting on Turkey? And I said, no, I haven't seen anything about Turkey. And he said, yeah, why? And so he presented 2 articles, one from the New York Times and one from NBC, about associates of Flynn's that were found guilty of lobbying for Turkey, and then Flynn's secret work for Turkey to get a cleric to get extradited to Turkey. And then he later filed his FARA paperwork, but it was in February after the inauguration had already happened. So this led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole on FARA. And I want to just kind of briefly present what I found, because this was new information for me. And I wanted to look into it and see what we could find out. So basically, the challenge is even if Flynn was falsely set up or set up to lie and entrapped by the FBI, and the FBI was going to actually close the investigation with his discussion with the Russian ambassador because there was no issues. Now, this Turkey thing is something that happened later, and it was discovered later after the inauguration, after the Trump administration came into office. So wouldn't you want to hold on to that lie entrapment thing, because later on we found out that there's this other potential wrongdoing with his failure to register as a foreign agent with Turkey and receiving money. I think it was $530,000 from Turkey for this purpose. Okay, so that's the allegation and the pushback against the Flynn case. So this is what I found out on the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This is from Foreign Policy Magazine, and it covers a lot about the act. And it was written, I think this was written a while back when all this was happening with Michael Flynn. Let's see if I can get a date on it. The date was July 22nd, 2019, so last year. Thanks to FARA's notorious breadth and vagueness, the law has a history of being weaponized by the U.S. government and by politicians to target political opponents. So that's down a few paragraphs from the beginning. The Act's sweeping definitions lead to absurd results. Consider, for instance, how it applies to members of Congress themselves. In testimony to Congress in the early 1980s, the noted Harvard University law professor Philip Hayman, who was then the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, explained that if a member of Congress visited Turkey and a Turkish government official made a request to the member to promote a policy favorable to Turkey, if the member thought the policy was a good idea and then supported it when he or she returned to Congress, he or she would then be an unregistered foreign agent. This crime could lead to penalties of up to 5 years in prison. As a result, Feynman said in his testimony, the Justice Department essentially ignored that such a request can create an agency relationship. But there's no official rule that concretizes this interpretation, and it seems to go against the text of the Act. So that's 1980s development that I read. And then I kind of learned more about it. There's a good Wikipedia article. This out of the Lawfare blog has a little bit more history of the FARA. The law was enacted in 1938 in the midst of the first House Un-American Activities Committee's investigation into the effects of Nazi propaganda efforts on U.S. soil. The law was designed to insulate American institutions of government from covert foreign influence by requiring that foreign propagandists disclose their political activities in the United States. In the first decades after its enactment, the Justice Department enforced FARA against propagandists from Germany and the Soviet Union through criminal prosecutions. Later changes, beginning with the amendments to FARA in the 1960s and culminating in the passage of the Lobbying Disclosure Act in 1995, precipitated a more lax enforcement model centered around voluntary compliance. This enforcement model has led many observers to criticize the law as ineffectual and innocuous. So that's what that paragraph says. And then I think down here, let's see, there's more on some of the history. From the Act's passage until 1966, FARA registration efforts were aimed primarily at traditional sign-holding political propagandists, and the Justice Department used criminal prosecutions as a primary method of enforcement. Beginning in the 1960s, as the Smith Act, otherwise known as the Alien Registration Act, which set criminal penalties for advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government by force or violence, took FARA's place as the central law regulating subversive activity. FARA enforcement shifted from criminal prosecutions to civil fines and encouraging voluntary compliance. This trend continued into the 1990s and early 2000s, during which time FARA was used primarily to coax lobbyists to voluntarily register themselves as agents of foreign powers. Recently, the Justice Department has begun to pursue the registration of lobbyists more vigorously, as evidenced by the recent high-profile prosecutions. Given FARA's poor recent record of criminal enforcement and a history of lax voluntary compliance, a number of legislative proposals have been introduced to consider ways to strengthen FARA's effectiveness in combating traditional, non-anonymous sources of political influence. These include a proposal to provide the Justice Department with civil investigative authorities. So that's a little bit about it. It looks like it's a little bit vague. It's gone through some revisions, and it's been inconsistently applied, certainly since the 1960s. And it seems like recently, and you can go on the Justice Department's website and you can actually see the most recent cases and who they're for and what the purpose is. So the allegation is that Flynn was in violation of the FARA law because of this relationship with Turkey. Then Flynn actually went out and filled the FARA paperwork, but I guess it was too late because, it was 6 or 8 months or whatever time period after that agency had already happened. So that was a pushback. But what was noted in National Review was that the prosecutors in the Flynn case with regards to Turkey and FARA didn't find reason to prosecute. Now, okay, prosecutors didn't find reason to prosecute. The pushback against that would be, well, they're Trump prosecutors. And so the Trump administration would be more friendly to that kind of defendant or person who's being investigated. So who knows? I think we don't really know the whole story. And demonstrating an issue of charity, I think that probably from all perspectives, they were trying to do the right thing. I don't think Michael Flynn was trying to hide anything by not disclosing a Turkey affiliation or receiving money from Turkey. I think that lobbying for other interests around the world is, less uncommon than we may suspect because the global economy, globalism, we have international corporations, we have lots of interests that have interest in other markets, other places, other countries. So it makes sense to me that countries would hire people to act on their behalf and push their agenda forward in foreign countries. Now, registering it makes sense. I have no problem with that. But I don't know that Michael Flynn was trying to hide anything by not registering or failing to register. Maybe he was, but I'm going to extend charity to him. And likewise, I'm going to assume that the FBI agents maybe were thinking that this was something they needed to do because Michael Flynn and there was something there. There was got to be something there. That, like one of my friends who was a never Trumper Republican, defected to the Democrat side, he said, when there's a lot of smoke, there's got to be a fire. And you may remember that phrase from a couple of years ago, where there's a lot of smoke, there's got to be a fire. Guess what? There was no fire. We never found the collusion. So false assumptions, that's okay. Hindsight's 20/20, but in the moment, maybe these FBI agents were acting like they, what they thought was the best interest. But I do want to point out two former FBI agents from a blog, Law and Crime. Two former FBI agents see the handling of the Michael Flynn interview completely differently. Okay, differently. What does that mean? There's a split of opinions among Americans on whether the FBI acted properly or improperly during its investigation of former National Security Advisor and retired General Michael Flynn. Former FBI agents are also split, but their insight into the Bureau's nuances is more scrupulous given their former positions. Bobby Koken told Law and Crime on Thursday that an ambitious FBI leadership combined with now former FBI attorney Lisa Page's apparently self-professed unfamiliarity with the process of dealing with this U.S. Code case definitely both created some of the mess, which Shakin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, described as twofold. First, Shakin saw the clear violation by the government for failing to turn material favorable to Flynn over to his defense lawyers as required by Brady v. Maryland. Second, the mindset of the executives and agents involved in the Flynn interview was also a problem. Quote, we have already seen a giddy former director James Comey explain that he thought he could get away with sending over two agents to see Flynn by violating traditional protocols for White House visits. And now we see the FBI's head of counterintelligence asking if our goal was to get him fired or get him to lie. Chacon said during a conversation with Law and Crime, in my 27 years as an FBI agent, my job was never to get someone fired, ever. The fact that this was even a consideration shows that there were ulterior motives to work among the top FBI officials involved in the Flynn case, he said. He pointed to this violation of protocol as evidence that something was, or perhaps still is, amiss. Agents, simply put, are trained to do things by the book. To get him to lie is very different from someone lying to the FBI, Chacon said. He explained, quote, "What steps did the FBI take to get him to lie? Well, we already know the first step, stated by Comey, was to get away with violating protocol. The admission by Comey that he ordered agents to violate White House protocol and knowingly take advantage of the chaotic atmosphere in a new administration. Every new administration faces some level of chaos in their first few days in the White House. Coupled with Assistant Director E.W. Priestup's admission that one of the goals may have been to get Flynn fired, clearly lays out activity that is outside the FBI's operating rules and may even indicate entrapment. Someone lying to the FBI is one thing, but the FBI getting him to lie in order to achieve its goal of a prosecution or termination is clearly another. This was a bungled operation from the very inexperienced FBI director and a group of senior FBI executives who long ago left active investigations to pursue their management power aspirations. These clumsy investigative missteps and Brady violations are proof that these guys had not conducted active investigations in many years, and the true nature of their efforts seemed to be more political than investigative." So, two former FBI agents, that's their perspective with investigative work in their background. Anyway, I thought I'd flesh that out a little bit after some of the comments from yesterday. I hope that helps if you listened to yesterday's show and want to get a little bit more feedback. I appreciate the comments because I want to practice what I preach. And if you're going to push against my narrative, of which I know I have some sticky narratives, then I will consider it. And hopefully I'll be able to point out errors. But if I can't, then hopefully I'll be able to adjust my narrative to be more informed and more complete of the information that's out there. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. Smash that like button, subscribe, and I will see you later.